prevalence of 10 years. So we can all get immune to statistics. It is so important that everybody understand that behind every one of those numbers is a person living with autism. Today in this country, 3 million people woke up and they're living with somewhere on the autism spectrum, and they have needs across the lifespan. Many of those individuals have seizure disorders. A third of them are nonverbal. They have GI issues. Many of them want employment opportunities, or they want an independent living or housing opportunity. Not enough of that is available to them right now, given the status, programs and services and research that we're doing in this country. We've got to do better.
Families all across America and around the world are devastated by their child's diagnosis of autism. Millions of parents are left with broken hearts, grieving the loss of their child to this neurological abyss with no known cure in sight. Chicago, Illinois has the third largest public school system in the nation, servicing roughly 400,000 students each year. Many of those students have an autism spectrum disorder.
In fact, he was born perfectly normally developing, and over time he lost his speech. He started to withdraw into himself. He started to have GI issues. And he was diagnosed, and what they recognized was that there was very little awareness of autism, that they couldn't get answers from their own doctors, and if this is happening to us, this has got to be happening to many, many other families around this country and around the world.
Autism is a group of developmental disorders that fall on a spectrum from mild to severe. Autism-like symptoms are characterized by impaired social interactions, problems with verbal and nonverbal communications, continuous repetitious behaviors, severely limited interests in activities, lack of attention, and trouble focusing on and maintaining eye contact. Autism can impair basic life skills, such as toileting, eating, bathing, learning, and communication. Another way of looking at it is when we look at the autism spectrum, there is one end which reflects those with the most severe symptoms, such as spinning, hand flapping, repetitious behaviors, stimming, antisocial behaviors, and are nonverbal. Those that fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum have symptoms that are more mild and may be verbal or have some language skills. On the other end of the autism spectrum is what was known in the DSM-4 as Asperger's syndrome. There are less autism-like features or symptoms. Most of these individuals have a much higher level of functioning independently. They are verbal before the age of 5, possess a higher IQ well above 70 or the average. The same one, guys, okay?
Okay.
We don't want to mix our colors, right?
Yeah.
All right. What is this? All right. Want to try the blue? Ready? Here we go. Here we go. In between the lines. Start right here. Right here. Here. Come on. Start right here. Right here. Come on. Right here.
Stay on the lines. That's not how we do it. Stop playing games on the line. Alright.
The rising rate of autism and the number of children affected has grown substantially. In the 1980s, 1 in 10,000 children was diagnosed with autism or an ASD.
In 2012, 1 in 88 children was diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder.
Yet no one in Washington, D.C. is sounding the alarm. If a tornado of this magnitude ripped through Washington, D.C., there would be alarms going off left and right. If a war broke out, affecting 1 in 88 Americans, you can bet the federal government would announce a national emergency. Anytime a foreign war breaks out overseas, we immediately involve ourselves. The Autism Network combines data from several websites to try and identify the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in children here in the United States. In March of 2014, the Autism Network adjusted those numbers. As a result, this caused a political shitstorm in Washington, D.C. and left politicians and the mainstream media scrambling. On November 29, 2012, there was a federal response hearing on the rise in autism rates, broadcasted live on C-SPAN. The purpose of this hearing was to address a variety of issues related to autism. Very little attention was given to this hearing in the mainstream media.
If the numbers are accurate, and if they continue to grow from the now 1 in 88 that in some way are ASD affected, we in fact have an epidemic.
Now we've gone from 1 in 10,000 children known to be autistic to 1 in 88. It is worse than an epidemic. It is an absolute disaster.
The toll of ASD is significant and has profound implications for affected children and their families.
I hope to be able to stress the negative consequences on us all when so many are enduring financial, logistical, and emotional stresses of a magnitude that might surprise you.
You studied this in 2007, we saw 1 in 150 children so diagnosed. And then in 2009, 1 in 110. And now we've diagnosed 1 in 88. 1 in 54 boys. Have you ever seen anything in which there has been such a dramatic progression in the incidence of diagnosis in a 6-year period?
Yet a disaster or catastrophe like autism spectrum disorder does not raise the alarm. Does anyone else see a train wreck heading our way?
Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. A third of the population is nonverbal. And then you have people at the other end of the spectrum who are very verbal. Autism is a lifespan disorder, and the needs of someone with autism evolve as the person grows up. You know, we often hear autism talked about just in the context of children or childhood disorder because we're so focused on early diagnosis and detection, which is critical. But the fact is, there are 3 million people in the United States right now who are living with autism, and they age from 2 all the way through their 80s. And we have got to develop a national strategy to address the needs of the community across the lifespan.
Autism is becoming a growing epidemic in the United States, and it definitely needs to be addressed. And the numbers that he pointed out earlier, that it used to be 1 in 10,000 kids got autism, it's now 1 in 88. And I'd like to ask Dr. Boyle, why? And I don't want to hear that we have better detection. We have better detection, but detection would not account for a jump from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 88. That is a huge, huge, huge jump.
One of the problems with what the CDC does is they don't break out the categories. So we don't even have the tools to inspect the claim that there's been diagnostic expansion, that the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome made a difference. Asperger's syndrome is a very small proportion of the total categorized cases, less than 10%. The designers of DSM-4 wrote about it. They said it was supposed to be a corrective narrowing of the diagnosis. That was their intention.
Is autism considered a disease or a disorder?
The former chairman of the full committee, Dan Burton, who years ago began a process of focusing on some aspects of this terrible disease.
Then around 1990, something new and terrible happened to a generation of children. Autism rates didn't just rise, they multiplied. This escalation covered both full syndrome autism and the broader autism spectrum, including Asperger's.
This is more of an explosion to me. Would these statistics be acceptable if they were for polio, Ebola, or bacterial meningitis? Doubtful, especially if your home state were either Arizona, New Jersey, or Utah, which saw the highest increases of autism out of the entire union.
So when you see those numbers rising, that's not because the methods are changing, it's because there are more cases.
The confusion of where did these numbers come. The DSM-4, which is what diagnoses people and constructs what the criteria is for who deserves a diagnosis, not once has anybody said here today that one of the reasons for the expanding diagnosis was the expanding criteria to what meets a diagnosis.
The Diagnostic Statistical Manual 4, also known as the DSM-4, became the DSM-5, and once again changed their criteria as to what meets a positive diagnosis for autism. This is the old criteria listed in the DSM-4 for what meets a positive diagnosis of autism.
I may get these numbers wrong, but in the old book, I believe it was 6 mandatory criteria for a diagnosis of autism. So if you got 5 but not 6, back in those days, it was mental retardation. So the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome in 1994 certainly opened up the book to a plethora of people, including myself, who never otherwise beforehand would have qualified for an autism spectrum disorder. But even traditional autism, the definition was changed in that book.
Individuals with Asperger's syndrome have normal communication and language development, but impaired social skills and behaviors that affect their interests and activities. According to the DSM-5, the criteria that meets a positive diagnosis for an autism spectrum disorder is broken down into 4 categories, A, B, C, and D. These symptoms must be present in early childhood and affect the child's everyday functioning. The changes in the DSM-5 will reflect that diagnosis will be called Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, and there no longer will be sub-diagnoses of autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or disintegrative disorder. However, patients may wish to continue to self-identify as having Asperger's syndrome, although the DSM-5 diagnostic category will be ASD.
The new criteria will be applied in the next round of surveillance that the CDC does. For the diagnosis of Asperger's, that label will go away, and that's been quite controversial.
In 1935, Leo Kanner wrote this book. It's 537 pages long, not a whisper of autism in any of it. Before 1930, the rate of autism in the world and in America was effectively zero.
I come from a state where it's 1 in 47. And I've heard a couple of other members ask questions about differences in incident in different regions. And I'm one that represents a state that's sort of at the one end of the scale, from Utah. I've always been an advocate for responsible funding and research for NIH to try to figure out what's going on with this issue. I'd like to ask both of you if you can tell me, based on your organization's research, have you been looking at these geographic disparities, where a state of Utah is 1 in 47 instead, and can you offer me any information that helps me understand why my state has a different number from the national average?
The CDCs, they go around and they look at medical records that are existing. They do not talk to children. There's no clinical evaluation. They don't talk to parents or anything. And that partly accounts for some of the differences when you go around the country. Some schools have better records, some schools don't.
There are currently no national data collecting, record-keeping procedures, or guidelines for states to use and share their findings.
In March of 2014, the CDC announced on their website that the numbers were actually revised to reflect 1 in 68 children here in the United States would be diagnosed with an ASD.
But that is not a national figure. That is only for select cities and states.
The Korean study that we financed, we went through the same process in Korea with Koreans, with Japanese, with Americans, and we ended up finding out that there was about 1% of the population, which is just what we had here. But then a second thing happened. Parents wanted to offer comments. We had 1% more of the entire community, of that same community, diagnosed with autism. Well, we brought people in, and so the number is 2.657%. I have no reason to believe that that number won't be duplicated in the United States.
Today, nearly 70 years after Connor's paper, reported autism rates are 1 in 88. In New Jersey, 1 in 29 boys born in 2000 were diagnosed as autistic.
The CDC has ADAM sites, their autism sites. This study reflects 11 different sites. In the past, it's been 14. So it's not a general population study, but it is a comparison, apples to apples, from the last 2 years, when they did it 2 years ago and 2 years before that. And what we have seen is a staggering doubling of the prevalence since the CDC first started doing these studies back in 2000 and 2002, and a 30% increase in just the last 2 years. We can diagnose children as early as 2. This study reports that we've really still 4.5 to 5 years old is the average age of diagnosis. In minority communities, the Hispanic and African American communities, diagnosis is as late as 8 years old.
Autism affects families across all racial demographics, income levels, socioeconomic status, educational levels, and both genders.
We also know that gender plays a big role. Many believe that the 4-to-1 ratio of boys to girls being diagnosed is at least partially a self-fulfilling prophecy, with girls less likely to be identified because they don't fit the stereotype.
Some studies have shown that African American, Hispanic, and Asian children are less likely to receive an early diagnosis. These delayed diagnoses cause minority children to be further behind in the development of language and motor skills.
Some early intervention programs for autism include ABA therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, food therapy, physical therapy, and behavior therapy.
We must also continue to invest federal research dollars in new and evolving therapies to improve the lives of those with autism spectrum disorders. In my district, we house the Kennedy Krieger Institute, an internationally recognized institution dedicated to improving the lives of individuals with developmental disorders. These institutions improve the quality of life, education, and continued development of those affected by autism spectrum disorders, and we must continue to support them.
The vast majority of disability services are financed through Medicaid. If that program were block granted or otherwise significantly cut, those services would be devastated. I cannot emphasize this enough. Ending a robust federal commitment to Medicaid means ending any meaningful chance we have to support autistic people.
As you can see in this graph, Medicaid and CHIP, also known as Children's Health Insurance Program, cover about half of all the medical costs for those with an ASD. However, the number of people enrolling in these programs is rising dramatically every year. Who pays the price? What is the real cost of autism on our society?
I'm very proud to represent a premier institution involved in the research and service provision of people with autism. Specifically, the Therapeutic School and Center for Autism Research, operated by the Easter Seals in my congressional district as a part of the Illinois Medical District, which is the largest medical district in the country. This one-of-a-kind facility is unique in the nation because it combines on a single campus educational, research, training, early intervention, school-to-work transition, and independent living capabilities.
Families and communities around the world are struggling to meet the financial obligations of supporting children and adults with autism. The costs are rising exponentially in the service needs for healthcare, education, and the long-term care of dependent adult living capabilities for those children that reach adulthood whom are unable to support themselves after their caregivers are gone. As the number of children with autism rises worldwide, so do these costs. There is no strategic plan of how to sustain the appropriate support services, medical needs, insurance coverage, early detection and interventions, research, educational and employment assistance programs that are already in place. what are the real costs of autism in our global society?
There's something wrong with this picture. There's something wrong. Congress, although we put nearly $250 million a year directly into research,
the NIH leads federal research efforts on ASD, investing $169 million in fiscal year 2011, 3 times more than 10 years ago. In 2009 and 2010, $122 million in additional American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds were also invested.
Our FY 2012 autism budget is about $21 million.
In just the last 5 years, the United States has spent well over $2 billion on disaster relief for tornadoes. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall and cost the United States over $125 billion. Now let's take a look at the President's fiscal year budget request for 2015. Autism falls under the category for health and development with disabilities. That's $53 million. Part of this additional $71 million may also go towards autism. But exactly how much and how will it be spent?
Once diagnosed, individuals with autism spectrum disorders have average medical expenditures between 4 and 6 times greater than the rest of the population. The Harvard School of Public Health has estimated that it can cost $3.2 million. To care for an individual with autism over the course of a lifetime.
That is for 2012 and 2013, which excludes the rise in medical costs starting in 2015 under national healthcare policies from Obamacare.
They're saying that the person in their lifetime, the care cost is $2.3 million, and they say that it costs the country, I didn't realize it was this magnitude, $137 billion a year in annual cost this country for care of autism.
$137 billion annually on ASD expenses, but never mentions it in budget talks.
Varies by locale, certainly to some degree, in terms of what provisions are based in the community and their level of availability.
Although insurance covers some of these costs, intensive behavior therapies, often paid out of pocket, can cost as much as $60,000 per year. For families of average or limited means, that means that limited access will also occur to treatment. What level of access do low-income children have to behavior or therapeutic interventions before they reach school age?
Without good health insurance, the extra care is virtually unaffordable for most Americans. Harvard researchers found that there are substantial costs in healthcare and education for children with autism. Harvard researchers estimate that the added costs of autism-related healthcare and education average more than $17,000 per child per year in the United States. On a national level, the researchers estimated that these additional costs exceeded $11.5 billion in 2011.
For parents of more challenged children, we're talking about ABA therapy in the home. We're talking about a variety of educational strategies. We're talking about an appropriate education and perhaps, just some aftercare if the child is significantly, challenged enough. For someone that isn't as challenged, we need much more enforcement of IDEA in the schools.
Thousands of kids living with autism may lose some critical services because of Governor Bruce Rauner's proposed budget cut.
Recent cuts made to the state's autism program.
It's time to make education our top priority again, and that's what this budget does.
Governor Rauner's decision to eliminate funding for the state's autism program.
And about 45,000 people in Illinois are diagnosed with autism. The proposed budget cuts.
Earlier this month, Rauner made the decision to stop funding immediately to the state's autism program for the rest of this budget year. The cuts mean over 2,000 people in the Rockford area could lose services. The fate of thousands of kids living with autism may be hanging in the balance because of Governor Rauner's proposed budget cuts. Governor Rauner plans to make $4 million in cuts to the state's autism program by eliminating services under his proposed budget.
Has eliminated the autism program entirely. That's $4 million.
The state's autism program is on the chopping block and threatening services for people and families living with autism. Families say they're devastated by the news. This news comes on the same day as World Autism Day. The Illinois Autism Project, or TAP, says Governor Rauner confirmed yesterday that funding for autism programs will be cut for the rest of the budget year. Reps from the TAP program say since they just found out about the cuts today, they don't know what they're going to do about funding yet.
Why do we expect our school systems to handle all of these additional costs after catastrophic budget cuts? IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. By law, all children here in the United States are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. IDEA was originally enacted by Congress in 1975 to ensure that children with disabilities have the opportunity to receive a free, appropriate public education just like other children. The law has been revised many times over the years. The most recent amendments were passed by Congress in December of 2004, with final regulations published in August 2006, Part B for school-age children, and in September 2011, Part C for babies and toddlers.
We know that between the ages of 2 and 5, we can make a dramatic difference in the development of the child who's had a diagnosis. If that child is not eligible for insurance coverage, he or she will enter kindergarten having had no therapy. The schools, the public schools, inherit these children who are with significant special needs. The school districts don't want to deal with them, but they won't release the kids because they get reimbursed by the state government, right, based on how many kids they have with special needs. The schools, the insurance companies, the parents end up being their child's only advocate. And this fight can go on. These parents have to go back year after year to their school districts to fight for the right kind of education or services that they deserve. We've just got to set our priorities here. And again, it's pay now or pay a lot more later. Look at this population. These kids are going to go through school without the kind of services and supports, speech therapy, behavioral, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Without those, they're just going to age out of school at 22. And then whose problem are they? Again, they could be very productive members of society, making jobs, paying taxes, to your point about resources, things that everybody wants to do, the dignity that comes with a job and the financial independence. They are a lot less capable of doing that if they haven't had the supports on the front end in the school system. When they're 23, 24, 25, they don't have the life skills and they don't have opportunities. And then they don't have housing options either.
One self-contained classroom for primary, secondary, or high school students with an autism spectrum disorder requires the following: at least one certified special education teacher, one-on-one paraprofessionals and classroom assistants, physical therapist, speech therapist, occupational therapist, case manager, school counselor, English language learner support, and sometimes a school nurse to administer medications. These are just some of the costs for public school special education classrooms. Looking beyond childhood, while the Harvard study looked at children, the majority of autism's lifetime costs appear to be associated with adulthood. These costs, including housing, disability support, and lost productivity, are set to skyrocket as increasing numbers of children with autism reach adulthood.
Students diagnosed with ASD are now of age where they are applying to higher education institutions across the United States in the same record numbers. It is estimated that within the next 2 years, 1 of every 100 college applicants will have an ASD diagnosis. Within the next 2 years, 1 of every 100 college applicants will have an ASD diagnosis. 1 of every 100 college applicants will have an ASD. 1 of every 100 college applicants will have an ASD. 1 of every 100 college applicants. 1 of every 100 college. 1 of every 100. 1 of every 100. 1 of every 100. And this is just the beginning of the wave that has been characterized as epidemic.
Epidemic is an understatement. Now is the time to sound the alarm.
Mercier's president Tom Gamble emphasized that Mercier's believes that capable students, if given the environment and opportunity to succeed, will do just that. Dr. Gamble has committed Mercier's to continuing the development of the Asperger program. Very few colleges and universities across the United States offer a program of collegiate support like AIM. Few have ever held up a part-time job or understand the nuances of the workplace. Jane Tearfield Brown cautions in her book, Students with Asperger's Syndrome, A Guide for College Personnel. The 1 in 88 number of incidents cited by the CDC will begin to be realized when overeducated and under or unemployed adults with AS are brought into the welfare and social services systems. Individuals without jobs will pose a burden on their families, on insurance companies, and on federal and state social services.
What can we possibly do for those children that are aging out, so to speak, of the services on that? We did have in the Higher Education Opportunity Act a couple of years ago a provision that was carried in the House, and Senator Kennedy carried it in the Senate for colleges and community colleges to address programs of sustainability for at least those on the spectrum that were able to be addressed and be helped by that. Unfortunately, in the next iteration of the budget, it didn't get funded again.
The entitlement to a free and appropriate public education ends at age 21, but the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires that transition planning begin at age 16 and become a formal part of the student's individualized education plan, also known as their IEP.
As they age out, we're facing a tsunami of unmet needs for services. The vast majority of these children can't advocate for themselves, or when they become adults, they're going to be disabled, they're going to be dependent, they can be abused.
This means that by or after age 21, all students with an ASD must leave high school and transition to higher education, or parents take over the full responsibility of their care.
Department of Education data has also showed us that low-income and minority youth on the spectrum have the lowest rates of employment and higher education access in the years after they leave school.
In other words, there's nothing that we're doing to them. It looks like we don't have any mandated services for them, and that it falls. The Affordable Health Care Act may help to provide some, medical services, but this is tragic if we have not found, not a bridge, but a way to accommodate an adult who may still become a functioning member in some way in society.
We now have a large group of individuals, 80s, 90s, who are the primary caretaker for an adult child, 60 or 70. The portability of Medicaid is a major issue because sometimes when that person needs a caretaker, if that's the condition, the caretaker lives in another state, the individual moves to the state, he has to get put on a waiting list. It could be 5, 6 years.
We had people come before my committee whose children they were afraid of. They would lock the doors when the kids got out of control because they were so big. People that mortgaged their homes and lost everything they had taking care of their kids.
The ABLE Act, which is not confined to autistic children, but to disabled, and it's just the savings. And that has 240 co-sponsors in the House and can't get to the floor, but you only need 218 votes. So I would urge you to try to get that to the floor and get that passed with 240 co-sponsors. That is something that can help families, especially working on aging children when the parents are able to put some money into that account.
The ABLE Act, which is a 529 medical savings account tax-free for families with disabled individuals so that they can save for all the needs that come with having a disability. And also for TRICARE legislation, we've been fighting very hard to make sure that our veterans get the same kind of autism benefits, insurance benefits, that the federal civilian workforce gets and that the general population gets.
Qualified disability expenses. Some of those qualified disability expenses include education, tuition for preschool through post-secondary education, the books, supplies, and educational materials. That includes tutors and special education services, housing, expenses for primary residence, including rent, purchase of a primary residence, moving expenses, home improvements and modifications, maintenance, repairs, and utility charges. Expenses for transportation, including use of mass transit, the purchase or modification of vehicles, also employment support, expenses related to obtaining and maintaining employment.
There is autism insurance for home or office or wherever in 32 states, covering 75% of the population of the country. That has to be brought back here to Congress so the ERISA companies, who are exempt from that, which are the largest companies in the country and occupy roughly half the working population. We now have half the working population in the smaller companies protected, but not the larger ones. That has to be done by Congress. That has to get on the table. In past years, that was not a difficult proposition. It's an equity issue.
Out-of-pocket costs for a parent who doesn't have insurance or whose insurance company doesn't cover it can be $60,000 a year for a family. That's for the speech therapy and the behavioral therapy. That's a second mortgage for people. Almost nobody can afford that out of pocket. So in states where we don't have any insurance mandates or where employers don't have an autism benefit, these parents are out of luck. And what we see is that many parents will end up being a one-income household because one parent will have to stay home to take care of the child.
I want to tell you a story. We all react to our lives. And I remember people talking about hormone replacement. It's going to save women's lives. You got to take it. Yet every nurse I talked to said, go to the bank, it causes cancer. Every relative that got cancer said they got it because of the hormone replacement. I'm hearing the same kinds of stories on vaccination. I must have had 50 different parents write me or come to me and say I had a healthy child, yet then they had 10, 9, 6 vaccinations at one time, and that child changed overnight and was knocking their head on the wall, and it was a changed child. In fact, I had a family in my office today where the mother broke down crying, saying my child was wonderful, bright, precocious, talking. She took those vaccinations and the child became very incredibly sick and has never recovered. So I'm interested in any studies on vaccinations and trying to understand that. Now, it used to be that you go and get a vaccination. My child never got more than 3 at a time. And in the state of New York, children are recommended to get 6 shots every 2 months throughout the first year of a child.
Many vaccines require multiple dosages, and some are clustered, so there are multiple vaccines per dose. This is the American Immunization Schedule that is recommended by physicians for parents to follow. Is it really necessary to give a newborn baby only 1 day old a vaccine or multiple vaccinations, especially if they are not being whisked away on some South African safari deep into the jungles with wild animals and insects lurking under every rock?
My question is, why does the schedule of these vaccinations require a child to receive so many shots in such a short period of time? You could plan those shots over a period of time. I'm for vaccinations. They prevent disease. I'm totally for it. But why do you have to cram 9, 6 at one time when the verbal evidence seems so strong from so many people that they had a healthy child until they got vaccinated?
Currently, there are only guidelines for vaccination schedules, which vary by state. However, they must be completed prior to attending school.
Children get as many as 28 or 30 shots before they go to the first grade.
The fact that they're cramming them down and having kids have 9 at one time, is that a cause? Do you have any studies on vaccinations?
Autism cases and infant exposure to mercury in vaccinations both increased dramatically in the 1990s, as seen in this chart. Vaccinations were required for the first time in 1977. The universal hepatitis B vaccination of infants started in 1991. This vaccination was recommended for 2, 4, 6, and 15-month shots in 1990. According to this graph, the United States and South Korea both had the highest number of vaccinations for children before the age of 5 starting in 2009, 36 vaccinations. The autism rate in 2011 for the United States was listed as 1 in 91, and in South Korea, 1 in 38.
I was on the city council. I sat through so many hearings where they vowed smoking was not bad for your health. It's a common sense that it was bad for your health. Then finally, the Surgeon General said it was bad for your health.
Think about all the smoking-related health conditions, birth defects, and deaths that were caused before the Surgeon General came out with their amazing warning label on every package of cigarettes.
My grandson got 9 shots in 1 day, and it turned him into a horrible situation that we found banging his head against the wall, couldn't go to the bathroom.
I'm here because of my grandson, Christian, who's now 11 years old.
He was a boy that was 2 years old, and we thought he was very precocious. He seemed to be brighter than average. He walked early. He had enormous vocabulary, and then he lost everything. We lost a little boy that we knew.
When you've got this combination of shots, and you go from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 88, it seems to me somebody would say, wait a minute, let's put the brakes on this, and at least let's try to figure out whether, if I'm giving a baby 9 shots in a day, somebody ought to say, wait a minute, let's put some brakes on this, and not saying don't deal with vaccines, just look at, whether the multiple shots.
When you put all these drugs or vaccines into children, the impact that these various vaccines might be having, combinations.
Why can't we change the guidelines and vaccination schedule? Why not try a new proposed vaccine timeframe?
40 years ago, whether it's true or not, this is what they're saying. I'd be interested in your thoughts. It's up 1,000%.
As a father was sentenced to life in prison after his daughter dies following 8 vaccinations in one day. Another article posted in Natural News mentioned that just days after a UK father was sentenced to life in prison for allegedly killing his own daughter, who reportedly died from unusual head injuries after receiving the MMR vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. An American father received the same sentence following the oddly similar death of his 12-week-old baby girl. John Sanders of Lansing, Michigan, has been sentenced to life in prison without parole after botched court proceedings found him guilty of murdering his 12-week-old daughter, Janiyah. The girl is said to have experienced severe brain hemorrhaging and gastrointestinal problems just 24 days after receiving 8 vaccinations in one day. Horrific side effects that were ultimately blamed on her dad.
I remember well, as I'm sure Mr. Burton does and some members of this committee do, a time when a provision was snuck into a bill on Homeland Security that essentially shielded from lawsuits the manufacturers of thimerosal. This was 10 years ago. And you know what? No one, for the members that have been here less than 10 years, no one knew where that provision came from. And it ended up getting buried in a conference report, and of course it passed. And I mention this because it's not as though we just discovered this matter.
Also buried in that Homeland Security bill are special interest provisions that limit liability. In addition to drug companies are airline carriers, airline security companies, and so on.
The component of thimerosal, one of the components supposedly to stabilize it, is mercury. Mercury can also be inhaled. And we're not only talking about drug manufacturers, we might be talking about coal companies too.
40 years ago, maybe we got 6 shots, now we're getting 40 shots. Is there possibility of any correlation?
This Congress and this government has not effectively addressed this issue. And when you had Lilly and others, Eli Lilly and others, contributed millions of dollars to try to affect the outcome of elections. I will tell you, well, I salute this chair for taking this on, because at the bottom of this, you have special interest groups who would resist any deeper research on it because it's going to affect their bottom line. Meanwhile, you have children all over the country turning up with autism. This goes way beyond thimerosal, and you could start thinking about coal. The United Nations Environment Program, in a piece called Mercury Control from Coal Combustion, says the burning of coal is the single largest anthropogenic source of mercury air emissions, having more than tripled since 1970. Coal burning for power generation is increasing alongside economic growth. The releases from power plants and industrial boilers represent today roughly a quarter of the mercury releases to the atmosphere. Now, this is from a report called Mercury Control from Coal Combustion, a study that was done by the University of Texas Health Science Center that showed what's called a statistically significant link between pounds of industrial release of mercury and increased autism rates. The study pointed out that community autism prevalence was reduced by 1 to 2% with each 10 miles of distance from the pollution source. The background of this study was during the time period studied by the Texas team. They quoted the US EPA estimating environmental mercury releases at 158 million tons annually nationwide in the late 1990s. Created a link between neurotoxic chemicals in the environment and increased rates of autism.
Mercury is a persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic pollutant. When released into the environment, mercury accumulates in water-laid sediments, is also ingested in fish, and is passed up the food chain to humans. Mercury contamination is a significant public health environmental problem. Now, despite efforts by federal and state governments, as well as the private sector, to reduce releases of mercury to the environment, mercury levels in fish continue to be of levels of concern. Now, how does mercury get into the environment in the first place? Well, mercury is introduced into the environment in 3 ways. First, mercury is admitted into the atmosphere naturally from volcanoes, the weathering of rocks, forest fires, and soils. Second, mercury is emitted as a result of human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels and municipal or medical waste. Lastly, mercury can be reintroduced into the environment through natural processes such as evaporation of ocean water. Because mercury is highly persistent, once released into the environment, all sources are of concern. Mercury exposure in humans can lead to a variety of negative health effects, including, but not limited to, neurological, kidney, gastrointestinal, genetic, cardiovascular, and developmental disorders, but also even death. Because mercury inhibits the normal development of the nervous system in young children and fetuses, New Hampshire's Fish Advisory recommends that women of childbearing age and young children limit their consumption of freshwater fish to no more than 1 meal per month. What exactly is in our food? Don't we have the right to know? If we are what we eat, then our food should be healthy and non-toxic, right? So why does organic food cost so much more? Think about all of the additives in our foods, like fillers, food colorings, sugars, high fructose corn syrup, various preservatives, sodium, pesticide and herbicide residuals, and hormones or antibiotics that are fed to the livestock. This is all in addition to any genetically modified crops or foods. Environmental toxins like heavy metals may also be present, like lead, mercury, or aluminum. Think about the chemicals that can leak into our food from plastic bottles or containers. What about mercury spills or disposal and cleanup? Now, because mercury is toxic, even small mercury spills should be considered hazardous and should be cleaned up with caution, and products containing mercury should be recycled or disposed properly. It's important to notate that there are many commercial and consumer products that contain mercury. For example, there are products like fluorescent lamps, thermometers, and batteries, which contain mercury. And why is this important? Here is just one example of how dangerous mercury in a broken fluorescent lamp can be. For example, this man had exposure to mercury powder from an Energy Saver globe. He stepped on it and spent 2 weeks in the hospital in the ICU.
Evidence points to a combination of genetic factors and environmental triggers.
Children are exposed to more brain-harming chemicals than ever before. A new report finds the number of chemicals contributing to brain disorders in children has doubled since 2006. In recent years, the prevalence of developmental disorders such as autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, and dyslexia have soared. While greater awareness and more sophisticated diagnoses are partly responsible for the rise, researchers say the changing environment in which youngsters grow up may also be playing a role. In 2006, scientists from the Harvard School of Public Health identified several industrial chemicals responsible for causing harm to the brain. For example, lead, mercury, and arsenic, which can be found in the soil, water, and pesticides. Exposure to these neurotoxins was associated with changes in neuron development in the fetus as well as among infants, and with lower school performance, delinquent behavior, neurological abnormalities, and reduced IQ in school-age children. There's growing evidence that autism is linked to pollution, with babies 283% more likely to suffer from the condition compared to other birth defects. For example, exposure to traffic fumes, industrial air pollution, and other environmental toxins can dramatically increase a mother's chances of having a child with autism. Russia Today aired a story about Dr. Janie Shelton's research. Dr. Janie Shelton is an epidemiologist and researcher at the University of California, Davis. She was discussing her case control study looking at the link between autism and pregnant women who are exposed to pesticides during the different trimesters of their pregnancies.
New study links autism to pesticide exposure. Now, as you mentioned, some previous research has shown a link between developmental disabilities and exposure to pesticides.
We mapped the historical addresses from the pregnancy and prior to pregnancy to the moms, and we could then evaluate if kids with ASD or developmental disorder, general intellectual impairment, were more likely to have mothers that lived in close proximity to these agricultural chemical pesticides. We saw a higher odds of autism among mothers who were exposed in the second and third trimesters. For example, in the second trimester, we saw for chlorpyrifos increases of between 2 and 3-fold in the risk of autism for mothers who were exposed in approximately 1 mile of their homes. We looked at 4 classes of pesticides that are known to be neurotoxic and have previously been established in the literature to have a link with either developmental delay or autism. So we looked at organophosphates, pyrethroids, carbamates, and organochlorines. And so organochlorines have really been phased out. So we actually didn't have enough people who had been exposed to organochlorines to look at that population. So we ended up only looking at 3 classes of those pesticides. The organophosphates are used in, they're very widespread. So for example, about between 70 and 80% of agricultural pesticides in the United States are organophosphate pesticides.
Now let's consider a state like Illinois, where 80% of the land area is used for farming. There are 76,000 farms in Illinois that cover roughly 28 million acres and mainly produce corn and soy. Now, all of this generates $9 billion annually for the economy, 40% of which is from just corn alone. Currently, there are thousands of American schools located within a 1-mile radius of these farmlands. I took a stroll through my own neighborhood on the north side of Chicago and noticed nearly every single patch of grass within a 3-block radius was chemically treated. I have no clue which chemicals or how often they are used.
Holy cow, the genetics aspects. Just to give you an example, we were scheduled to be a part of a genetics study for celiac expert, which is inherently a big process to autism. There are 10 kids in my family. Out of all the grandkids, out of the 17 grandkids, 13 have celiac sprue.
We need to stop investing in the autism gene hunt and identify what has changed in the environment that it could possibly have injured so many children.
I've got family history with this and the genetic factoring. We got to spend more time looking at the genetics because there is a trigger mechanism, and celiac sprue is one of those. Looking at casein as well. There's so many things, and you cannot point to me to a disease factor. Point to one of them. I dare you, and we'll find a dietary problem with diabetes, heart disease, thyroid conditions. You name them, MS. You're going to find a dietary aspect. So part of the problem we ought to be focusing on is the dietary aspects. I spent every night after my practice closed, going through aisles in a grocery store, looking at everything on the aisle to make sure it didn't have a gluten or wheat. Do you know how long that took? It is unbelievable what these people have to do. Absolutely unbelievable. And we got researchers who don't listen to them. To me, this is just absolutely incredible. And I think it's a slap in the face for these people to be looking at those aspects. And here's how affluent it was. One of my siblings has a son. They said was autistic. Thank God one of my sisters is a physician. And going through this tirade, we found out that she had celiac sprue. And she wondered, I wonder if this is the problem for her son. Isn't it interesting? We had a kid who was diagnosed or labeled as autistic, that as soon as we took him off of wheat, gluten, and milk products, this kid sits, reads, does everything appropriately. And I think we can manage this practice a little differently. Sometimes we're in the forest and we don't even understand what we're looking in the trees. Is manage these disease processes by family, by looking at that as our core group, and then start listening to people, asking a question. That's what we as physicians were taught to do, is ask questions and listen. And I think that's part of the biggest problem that we see in this research aspect, is we're not listening. And I think I see that frustration all over your face.
Who wakes up in the morning and says, this is my priority, I am going to drive this train and make sure something happens today?
With all the money this country wastes, why don't we have a simple national plan to combat autism? The costs to support an exploding population of children and adults with autism for the next several decades and more generations to come far exceed the costs associated with the inconvenience of investigating these possible causations.
What is being done to have a genuine, comprehensive plan in which we are looking for accountability year to year on the progress that's being made? What does it take for us to develop a comprehensive national strategy with real accountability and timelines?
The federal agencies responsible for the health of our children have failed in their duty. CDC's negligence has led the way. Many of us believe CDC has actively covered up evidence surrounding autism's environmental causes.
And why would Americans think that?
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Well, in Romney's world, the cars get the elevator and the workers get the shaft.
Read them my lips. Read my lips.
That the United States will not torture.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I
claim here the facts. If you make under $250,000, you will not see your taxes increase by a single dime. Not your income tax, not your payroll tax, not your capital gains tax. No, nothing, because the last thing we need to do is put more burdens on you.
This should not be passed by anyone unless they eat it. If they eat it, then I'm in favor of them passing it. Otherwise, don't pass it.
AGN Channel 365, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because there's never a dull moment in the American political system.
We've been at this in a comprehensive way for more than a dozen years, and there is a sense of impatience. I know that we were able to marshal huge amounts of money to combat the AIDS, the pandemic of AIDS. And Henry Hyde led the effort, George Bush, it was his idea, and we spent billions in combating AIDS, particularly in Africa, because the demonstrable need was married up with the resources to try to make a difference. Especially in light of what Autism Speaks has discovered in South Korea, the 1 in 38 study that they funded. We never saw a prevalent spike like we've seen on autism in Africa as we have seen in the last 15 or so years.
A group of us pushed for the Combating Autism Act of 2006. One of the critical provisions of that was the idea of a strategic plan to make IAC and to make the NIH funding mechanisms accountable to the public.
George Bush, President number 43, love him or hate him, he did pass an important and extremely valuable piece of legislation in 2006. In 2006, President George Bush authorized funds for fiscal year 2006 all the way through 2011 to fund autism research programs. This is equivalent to what Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s, when he authorized millions of dollars to go towards funding AIDS research programs. The Combating Autism Act of 2006 will increase public awareness about this disorder and provide enhanced federal support for autism research and treatment. After the Combating Autism Act was passed in 2006, many positive changes began to emerge. It was followed by the National Autism Spectrum Disorders Initiative Act, which was passed in 2011. Then, Autism Cares Act was passed in 2014. Today, we recognize April as the month for autism awareness. Autism Speaks continues to fund research on the lifetime costs of autism and how to meet them.
I see it as being sort of willy-nilly, and this is the next thing that gets funded today and somebody tomorrow, as opposed to a real focus on a critical path.
My first concern is the more standard apprehension concerning the direction and prioritization of government funding. Currently, the emphasis is on government research, and there is good herein, as well as fairness. For there is a vastly disproportionate amount of research funding for autism when compared with infinitely less prevalent conditions.
NIH, meanwhile, has received the lion's share of funding, money they've wasted on status quo research and gene studies. It's absurd to focus on genetic research in this crisis. There's no such thing as a genetic epidemic.
What could be more important than to spend our tax dollars on autism research?
In 2010, NIH spent about $217 million on autism research. Of that, only 2.5% went to research on improving the quality of services. Only 1.5% went towards research on autistic adults and our needs. When you try to go for studies, the coordination of studies is inherently poor.
Is this really poor coordination, or is it a cover-up? While all of this is going on, our federal government is funding studies of why lesbians are obese, an excellent use of our taxpayer dollars. Or the $2.6 million studying the drinking habits of Chinese prostitutes in China.
The University in Detroit was granted nearly $3 million to teach prostitutes in communist China a very important lesson, how to drink responsibly.
U.S. tax dollars are paying to educate prostitutes and their pimps in southern China on how responsible drinking can prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS.
And of course, my personal favorite, the $682,000 spent studying the stress levels of shrimp walking on a treadmill. Walking on a treadmill all day in front of a group of people that you don't know wearing white lab coats would be a stressful experience for anyone, especially a shrimp.
because the people in this room, I take it, are going to go home and they're going to have to wrestle with this with love and affection 24/7. They're reaching into the future and saying, you know what, we want to understand what's happening here. We also need some help right now. Right now. Let's put some brakes on this. That have been crying and women crying.
All these families who are here, you have members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are dedicated to trying to find out what's going on here and to try to do it in the interest of your family and future generations as well.
I thank you for caring about somebody other than your children and yourselves. What you are doing here today is raising this issue so that other children, other than those, or other folks, other than those maybe in your own families, maybe your friends, will benefit in the future. In other words, you are touching the future, and you are making it possible for those who are going through the autism spectrum disorders to have a better future.
And now we will have another generation of children growing up with autism. Each generation is larger than the last. Think about what neighborhoods and schools will look like in just 10 years from now. Dr. Stephanie Seneff, a research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, believes that based on her research, that half of the children born here in the United States will be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder starting in the year 2025. What if she is right?